Well, I don't know if you already know, my angst about this presentation. I come to, especially after being at the first couple of days of the Institute, I came to my, re-preparing my presentation with kind of a sense of schizophrenia, if not multiple personality disorder. If you would look at my brief, you see that I am supposed to be speaking largely within discipline. I am a literature scholar, although I'll comment a little bit more on what that means to me these days. And on the other hand, after 12 years of being either associate director or the first post 9/11 director and the first literature specialist director of the Harriman Institute since the Harriman money was given in the early 1980s, I have a lot of baggage on the things that have been discussed. And so I've been trying desperately to figure out how I could get in everything. And I'm going to cheat a bit. I'm going to try to make Emigrations be the thread that runs throughout my presentation. But I also want to, in some ways, incorporate my experience having to deal as a regional institute director with the period, not just post-Soviet, but post-9/11. And also with the tensions of being in Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and balancing regions, disciplines, practice, policy, theory, humanities and social sciences on a day-to-day basis. I'll tell you, this is my grid, first of all. First of all, I'm going to be drawing largely on not just my experience. Well, my experience is one of my bullet points, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But also, I was charged, largely because Marshall Shulman at that point, although he was still very much with us, was really not feeling up to writing the history of the beginning of the Harriman Institute for the 250th anniversary book for Columbia University, which for those of you who have seen it, it's quite massive. It's called Living Legacies. And then we were celebrating our 60th anniversary at the Harriman Institute. So this little booklet, and I don't know if there are enough of them that the Institute would be willing to give them out to you, but it reprints my article on the beginnings of the Harriman Institute, some of which you've heard from David Engerman already. It also has lovely biographies of some of the founding and most important people in the Harriman Institute by other important faculty members of the Harriman Institute, and including a number of them who've already been at this institute. And then a nice touch, I think, is that it has some biographies of recent graduates of the Harriman Institute and what they do now. So again, I thought it was up on the Harriman website. It's not. But you're welcome. I can pass it around if you want to look at it, or you can look at it during the break. And again, there may be copies that can be gotten if you're interested from the Institute itself. What was going to be the primary subject of my remarks, but I think especially given my time constraints is going to be slightly more, is an upcoming article of mine that's coming out ironically in a history of Soviet literary theory and criticism, edited by Yevgeny Dobrenko and Galin Tikhonov, but I got to write the emigres, the post-war emigres. So this is coming out in October, and I will be drawing on that. And then I am going to be giving you some syllabi. They're already in front of you, because I thought, knowing and having discussed with Edward for some time the goals of the Institute, that seeing syllabi that we believe are, that all but one of them has already been used, or one of them has been used many times. The kind of syllabi, real classes that define for us what regional studies are in the 21st century. Following in the footsteps of my former dean, Bob McKay, I'm going to try and organize my presentation around bullet points. I don't usually do bullet points, but I thought it was probably a good idea. Otherwise, I was likely to ramble hopelessly. First of all, first bullet point, disciplinary tensions were an issue from the very beginnings of Sovietology and area studies. Okay, I'll come back to that. And we need to be extremely careful about distinguishing between various different terms, and being sensitive to the evolution of disciplinary concerns, something I think David Engerman addressed somewhat in his talks. Bullet point number 2, area studies in the United States trace their beginnings and evolution in no small part from the exclusion or marginalization of emigres. Okay. Point number 3, emigres nonetheless played a key role as what new historicist Stephen Greenblatt has called cultural intermediaries between the U.S. public and academics and Russia. And then again, this is in the academy and very much beyond. I wanted to work in somehow that I played hooky on Wednesday night and went to see at American Ballet Theater Sergei Ratmansky's production of The Bright Stream, a socialist realist ballet, which is a topic in and of itself. What do we do with, the artistic intermediaries that have been so much a part of the landscape of the United States since the post-war. And point number 4, and this is kind of my sleazy thread that's going to get me to the syllabi at the end, we really need to look at the significance of emigres as students, not just as professors and experts. Okay, so those are the 4 points I'm going to try to address, again, briefly. The clock is moving very fast. I was afraid I wouldn't have enough to say. Of course, yeah, those of you who know me laugh. Okay. But I want to situate myself for a moment because I think that although, as I think a Russian friend of mine once said, all American Slavists biographies and how they got into Slavic are all weird. But that makes me representative. First of all, despite my name, I am not an immigrant. I am married to one. And in fact, the only kind of blood I probably don't have is Slavic. Although I did have a grandfather who was born in Pilsen, but Austrian. In any case, I actually went to, but I desperately wanted to study Russian. And I couldn't, of course, growing up in New Jersey in public schools, even good ones. I studied French from a very early age, and so I went to college, and I picked my college out of Barron's College Guide because I wanted a college that had both one of the best French and one of the best Russian departments in the country and would also accept women, which in 1969 was a problem, okay? So I ended up at Brown University, which I was very fortunate to have ended up there, and was actually a French-Russian major and also got a master's in French at the same time while I was an undergraduate. So that's to put the comparative context out there, and also to point out that I did not consider majoring in comparative literature at the time. So that's one of the big evolutions that's happened, that more and more, although I consider myself very much a comparatist, if that was not an option, I wanted to be specifically in national language departments. And I'll come back to the obsession with Russian later. And I then was told in no uncertain term, and I also worked very closely. I'm kind of a closet historian. I worked with Tom Gleason very closely. I probably took more courses with him than with anybody else in the Slavic department. So I considered myself rather multidisciplinary from the very beginning. And then it was told to me over and over and over again, the only place I could go to graduate school was Columbia. And I resisted that. I grew up in New Jersey. I didn't want to go to school in New York City. But nonetheless, I found myself here and a student in the Russian Institute. Very much, I took courses my first year with John Hazard, my only law course ever, and with Mark Ryev, intellectual history, way over my head at the time. And also went on to be part of Edward Allworth's project in the year he didn't do Central Asia. And hopefully if he doesn't come up in this seminar, I believe he will, but there's a lovely biography of him in this book. And I'd be happy to talk more about him. Then, of course, went on to become a faculty member at Barnard. But I'm not going to go into the Barnard-Columbia relationship. If I got into all of those things, we'd be forever. And also got my Harriman certificate before then, and the rest is history. Now I'm going to go back to why did I want to study Russian to begin with? Because as I said, one Russian translator one day said, all Americans have a strange story. And I had no idea. I just wanted to study it. And then one day I was walking down College Walk, which you now all know very well. And I ran into my neighbor from when we were 3 and 4 years old, and he was in med school and said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm studying Russian literature here. And he said, oh, do you remember my nanny, Lizzie? And I said, yeah, sure, I remember Lizzie. He said, do you remember she was Russian? And she taught us Russian words when we were 3 and 4 years old. I have no memory of this to this day. But talk about cultural intermediaries. I mean, so in the role of emigres. And I suspect behind all of us American Slavs, there is some early cultural intermediary that more or less influenced our decisions to become Slavists. Now, as David Engerman pointed out, and I believe his point was very heavily indebted to Marshall Shulman, who believed in this very fervently, area studies really did not come out of the Cold War. It predated the Cold War, and it came out of the OSS and out of the war effort in various different ways, because not only the original faculty, for instance, of the Russian Institute at Columbia, but also the original students, many of whom had been, including Marshall Shulman, William Corey, had been redirected to their interest in Russia from their service in the war. But it also meant emigres were excluded, because as Marshall told me the story, when Gerard Tanqueray Robinson went to Washington to form the group within OSS, he was specifically told not to use emigres because of their biased position. Assumedly, they were also considered security risks. Hard to know, but that was what he said. And so the first generation of Slavic scholars were American, because many of them had come from other disciplines, or they were not Russianists. And so again, area studies, as we know it, largely came from the exclusion of emigres. I'm sorry, I just jumped to bullet point number 2 and jumped right over bullet point number 1, so I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But what I wanted to talk about before that is the issue of disciplinary tension, which I think is something that really needs to come up very strongly in your enterprise here, because to my mind it has always been and remains the primary promise and the primary challenge of studying this region across disciplinary boundaries. From the very beginning, it was a problem at Columbia because it had to be negotiated very, very thoroughly that every faculty member that was of the 5 founding fathers that were hired into Columbia had to be vetted by the relevant disciplinary department, and they had to get tenured. And this was a big negotiation to get this to happen. And quite honestly, all was not rosy from the very beginning about the relationships between the disciplinary departments and the Institute. There are 2 of us sitting in this room who were given opposite advice about whether to get regional institutes certificates by the same faculty member in the Slavic department. And Carol Yoland and I, we can elaborate on that later. But it was very often that faculty members in disciplinary departments would tell their PhD candidates not to go for Russian Institute certificates and to stay away from the Institute. So even here, where the program really flourished greatly, and we're very proud. I'm very proud to be a product of it. There were always tensions, and if anything, they became greater over the years. I think David Engerman talked about the increasing territorial nature of disciplines in the last 40 years, and that has made things even harder to negotiate for many reasons. So again, I'm happy to talk more about that in question and answer, but I'm going to move on from that now. I just think that we need to distinguish between the fact that we even have trouble finding a term. Area studies is no longer, considered. Area studies literally is a bad name. So I found myself as director of Harriman referring to it as regional studies. I'm not sure I buy Bob McKay's international studies rubric, which I don't think is really what we do. But we need to be very careful about distinguishing that from Slavic studies. And they're very different things. And both of them are subsumed under this institute. But Slavic studies really is the humanities. And it is very specifically that which is located in Slavic departments. And that's, of course, where the emigre story is going to be much more exciting. But to give you some ideas about the kind of tensions that we saw with literature, Bob Belknap, I don't know if he's coming back, but you can ask him about how he had to write 2 master's theses. Because he is a Dostoevsky specialist, and in those days, we've loosened up since, he could not put his Slavic department master's thesis on Dostoevsky in as his Harriman Institute certificate essay. He had to write another essay on socialist realism. That was in the days of Simmons. These days, we would not do that. Vera Sandomierski Dunham, one of the few literature people who was in Washington and who is part of the larger area studies story, taught at the Harriman Institute, not in the Slavic department, which was, I will be honest, a source of tension. And as I said, graduate students in arts and sciences were often discouraged from getting regional institute certificates. Now, in terms of being careful about our terms, it's important also to situate the evolution of Slavic studies in relationship to comparative literature and cultural studies. And if there's time, I'll come back to that later. I now consider myself mostly comparative literature and cultural historian, as well as being a Slavist. And we should also remember that Slavic studies per se were implicitly and sometimes explicitly excluded from Sovietology. For those of you who have read Steve Cohen's book, Sovietology as a Vocation, literature barely figures there except for mentions of Ernest Simmons. In other words, we were not part of Sovietology, for better or worse. So when you talk about area studies, again, we are the kind of the poor younger country cousin, out there someplace. And at the worst, there were social scientists, and I won't name names on this one, who simply considered Slavic departments to be service places for social scientists teaching them language. And that was it. And that was all we did, and they weren't interested in anything else. However, on the brighter side, as we look to the future, and that's one of the places I want to end, we need to look more and more at exile and diaspora studies as we look at emigres and what the Russian emigre experience, which an increasing number of graduate students are now interested in, going back and looking at early emigration in Russia, precisely in terms of this post-colonial paradigm of diaspora studies. Okay, so that's bullet point number 1, and a little bit of bullet point number 2. Okay, now we're bullet point number 2, and I'm really going to have to speed up. Now, again, as I pointed out, there was a reason that emigres played a limited or very specific role in regional studies. They were excluded from working in Washington during the war. And again, that is largely what gave impetus to a new generation of Americans who were Soviet specialists, including the founding fathers of the Russian Institute, all of whom were not Russian. Now, then, of course, emigres had the peculiar status of being basically the beast to be studied. David Engerman talked about the Harvard Refugee Project and the extent to which emigres, because of the limited access to the USSR for American scholars during the early period, that was what you had, and you were going to talk to emigres as a source of information. Obviously, this would change over time as there was increasing ability for American scholars to travel to the Soviet Union and to actually have direct contacts with people still living in the USSR, and ultimately to have students from the region. one place that emigres, of course, were particularly valuable was because so few universities had Russian studies and Russian language before the war, as the various different impulses that spurred the growth of Russian studies and Slavic studies in the United States happened. Emigres were greatly in demand, especially as language specialists. And here, one thing to bear in mind is that the growth of Slavic studies did not happen in isolation, and I don't know if David mentioned this, but of course there was an extraordinary growth of U.S. universities after the war. So one has to see this in this context, that it wasn't just, and I think he rightly pointed out, an awful lot of this happened before Sputnik, so the Sputnik craze did spur it, but again, a lot of it, and this has shaped our field very greatly, that literature studies was the incredible number of hires that were made in the 50s and into the 60s, which therefore left some of us without jobs for a very long time because, because departments were so large and so well staffed. But in other words, emigres did have a place, and some of us, again, I already talked about Lizzie. I will talk about some of my other favorite people. So I don't know how many of you ever knew Tatiana Roman, who was actually Gail Roman's mother, named shortened for Romanov, as she told us when it was a great revelation to me as a beginning language student, or relatively beginning language student, that her family had married down into the Romanov family. She had shortened her name. And she was an absolutely wonderful woman. Some of us from Columbia remember, of course, the wonderful Rose Raskin, who I'm sure Carol and I would be thrilled to talk more about. Nikolai Ozorov, who taught at both Columbia and Yale. And that's just a tiny number of people who really were our lifeblood of language. And what was really wonderful about it is someone who was one of the very few people who was able to go to the Soviet Union to study Russian after basically my first year of Russian, and came back as much to Mrs. Roman's dismay, speaking Soviet Russian. In other words, I was swallowing all of my endings so she couldn't tell which case I was putting anything in. Very deliberately, it was very useful. So in the Soviet Union, I was being told that my language was knyzhny, and here I was being told it was Soviet. But it was good to to get both perspectives. Now, bullet point number 3. Now, coming back to the post-war period, we need to remember another part of this. Just as America emerged from the Second World War in an enormously different place from where it was when it went in. I mean, it was a world leader, which it really wasn't going into World War II. And not only that, it was it had received an incredible bequest of intellectual life from those Europeans who were fleeing from the war, and not just Russians. And it's very important to see that the Russian emigres who came here did not come in isolation. I mean, and you're going to talk more about Roman Jakobson, but think about the people that Roman Jakobson met when he came here. Noam Chomsky, Levi Strauss. I mean, in other words, there was an incredible intellectual ferment going on in this country after the war. And some of the major emigres were very much a part of it. Now, this is supposed to be my major topic, but looking at the clock, I'm going to give it. I know that my colleagues here have a lot to say on the subject this afternoon. So I'm going to say relatively little about it. I have taken as my examples the obvious, Jakobson and Nabokov, the two who straddled the university and the public outside, the two who broke out of the emigre ghetto, but also always kept their commitment to Russian studies. Oh, a little sideline here. One of the things that gets left out in here is it wasn't just Russian emigres, obviously. And I had the great privilege of studying with Victor Terrace at Brown, and we can of course make a long list of Eastern and of course Elizabeth Falconer's father, Manfred Cradle, who taught Polish at Columbia. So we have to remember that there was part of this Slavic. The role of the Slavic emigre was also to bring the non-Russian Slavic literatures and cultures and languages to the United States. But, of course, Jakobson and Nabokov didn't get along. We won't go there. If you want to talk about that, you can do that more. But, I mean, when we think about the incredible impact that these two scholars alone had on American intellectual life in the post-war period, it's really rather stunning. Let me just look for a moment at Nabokov. I mean, because I am actually writing a book on Nabokov right now, so I could span Nabokov for an awfully long time. But Nabokov, although, you know, one could say he was an American writer, I personally believe he never stopped being a Russian writer. And in fact, it was precisely in the interstices between his Russian and his American experiences and his European experiences that he dwelled as a writer and as a person, and it's one of the reasons he's such a hot topic right now with diaspora studies, because emigration was so much a part of both his life and all of his various different projects. I just can't help but bringing up Pnin for many reasons here, because if there is a representation of the stereotypical Russian emigre in Slavic studies in the post-war period, Nabokov's Timofey Pnin would probably be the most endearing. And I will say that it was reading Pnin that brought me back to Nabokov. You know, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Pnin, the character of Pnin being based with some irony on Nabokov's colleague at Cornell, Mark Saftow. There's clearly a dole of Nabokov himself in Pnin, but it is the image of the somewhat awkward Russian emigre who is ghettoized into teaching language as he works away on this epic project that nobody will ever read, but which he loves dearly. And who can never quite get the difference between a football and a soccer ball, and who is relegated to teaching rather doltish American students who really, you know, although they do seem, some of them, to appreciate he's a nice guy, don't really get it. And I think that, you know, Nabokov, nobody better than Nabokov gave an image to the rather poignant situation of many of these Russian emigres who found their way into American academia. Nabokov, on the other hand, is the extraordinary success story. I mean, you know, because his fabulous, not just Lolita, even before Lolita, his extraordinarily successful literature course at Cornell, which so many people, I've met so many people at this point who've taken this course, you know, that even though it was his Western literature course that most of them took, of course, he worked some Russian in there. And by the way, I would also point out that Pnin was published in the New Yorker, you know, so this is, again, part of the, interpreting the Russian experience for the American audience was very much what Nabokov was all about. Now, with the third wave of immigrant, I'm sorry that's all I can say about Nabokov, but I'll never get any place if I go much farther. Things changed somewhat with the third wave of emigres. I mean, obviously I was talking primarily about the first wave of emigres here who came to the United States after as a result of the war. I have whipped over some institutions that probably should be mentioned that they brought with them or that served them well. But I think since David Ackerman talked a lot about institutions, I will skip that and go on to the third wave of the emigres. And they largely faced the same problems as the first wave, but obviously as the first generation of really Soviet citizens, people who had been born in the Soviet Union, who knew nothing else. The imperative of the first wave of emigration to preserve the true Russian culture, to someday take it back, and to somehow find a way of balancing, preserving that true culture with also conveying it to an American public that was not always, in their estimation, sophisticated enough to understand it. The third wave was very much directed and much more interested in what was going on in the Soviet Union. You know, again, I can create nice polarities between Brodsky on the one hand, who followed in the footsteps of Nabokov and Jakobson, becoming a figure on the American cultural scene, becoming the poet laureate of the United States, winning the Nobel Prize, going over into writing essays in English, and again, transcending the immigrant ghetto. Trying to, at the same, although again, Brodsky very much never left his Russian roots behind and remained very, very much connected to the Russian emigre community, as even did, by the way, Baryshnikov. You know, while he was out going to Hollywood, this was before Sex and the City, I think. But you know, but even Baryshnikov had a tremendous, as while Brodsky was alive, was very involved in literary projects for the immigration. On the other hand, there's Solzhenitsyn, who lived up there in Vermont and tried to pretend he was in Russia, and then occasionally came out and gave speeches, you know, like the notorious Harvard speech in. What was it, 1978, which disabused Americans of their belief that dissidents necessarily were Democrats. You know, so he was a cultural intermediary of sorts in the United States. But again, Americans were hearing more and more about the Soviet Union from journalistic sources and directly from the Soviet Union. So that also emigres became interesting as celebrities in the United States because they had been dissidents, largely. I mean, and so that's another. And so many of the writers who got academic appointments in this country got them because they had already become well known through their oppositionist activities in the Soviet Union before they left. Which leads me to bullet point number 4, emigres as students. Those emigres who came who were not celebrities were routinely advised at Columbia and I believe elsewhere, no matter what hallowed, exalted degree they had achieved in the Soviet Union, to go back to graduate school in the United States or they would not get a job. Okay, so there are a fair number of faculty members, even now, I would say Irina Reifman here at Columbia, who you know, went for her PhD at Stanford. This was not actually totally new because Alexander Dalin, the only emigre to be director of the Harriman or the Russian Institute, actually did his training in the United States. You know, so there had always been emigre students. But with the third wave of emigration, we found more and more emigre students, undergraduate and graduate. And I think this is a phenomenon that has happened more and more throughout the country. And on the one hand, this poses certain challenges in terms of pedagogy, because it's sometimes difficult to have heritage speakers of Russian and non-heritage speakers of Russian in the same classrooms. We are very fortunate here at Columbia because we have a big enough program and we have 2 tracks. And it works very, very well because students self-select, you know, they take classes together, but they self-select into the right classes, and some tensions that we used to have at one time we don't have any more. But I want to talk about a more interesting phenomenon than just the extent to which emigre students are our lifeblood. Not completely, but part of our lifeblood these days. And that is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, here I'm speaking more about graduate courses, but not completely. I have found myself more and more learning from my students because we have an extraordinarily diverse number of students coming from various different regions of the former Soviet Union. Let me stop for a second. I think, again, I think David Engerman probably raised this, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, regional institutes were really faced with, what are we going to do now? And one of the big questions was, are we going to be Russian institutes, or are we going to cover the entire area? Well, Harriman, I think, rightly decided we were going to do the whole area. And in fact, we ultimately took over Eastern Europe, too. But that means that, we have responsibility for an extraordinary diverse area, which, as Bob McKay pointed out, I think rightly, gives us enormous comparative possibilities. And also a lot of pedagogical challenges for those of us who are trained primarily as Russianists. Now, with all due respect to my former dean, I will say I think this is a development he may not be crazy about, but he's not a dean anymore. He pointed out that it was an unintended effect that all of the money that went into regional studies or Soviet studies was what filtered down to the liberal arts colleges. But we're very proud to say that Barnard graduated its first Hungarian regional studies undergraduate major and its first Polish undergraduate regional studies major this year, along with its second Ukrainian regional studies and following its first Czech regional studies major several years ago. And one of our Russian majors actually really did all the work for a Serbo-Croatian major as well. So this is really, now this is of course an anomaly for Barnard and Columbia. Columbia actually can't offer these degrees, but the courses are obviously being taught by Columbia graduate students and faculty. Again, that's a peculiarity of our institutional structure, but it also shows that even at the undergraduate level, we're getting more students from the region who have some knowledge. They're usually first generation here. Some of them were born there, some born here, and they want to study and they need to study because, as I think it's been said, sometimes sometimes if not always, it's harder to teach those who know something than those who know nothing. And so some of the emigre students who come from families where they've learned something have to unlearn some things that American students are just know nothing, so we can just pour stuff right into them. So that is an issue as well. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this courses precisely from the point of view of the students who have taken them, but I will, and what they are meant to accomplish. And I'm going to start with one that I have taught for almost 20 years, although the two first people to teach it, Legacies of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. You can ask Mark von Hagen to explain to you how many different titles it's actually gone through. He first taught it, first year it was taught in 1992, with Rick Erickson, the economist who was then director of the Harriman Institute, and Mark was associate director at that time. Traditionally, the course has been taught by the director and often the associate director of the institute. And this course was put into being precisely to deal with the issue of how do we maintain our coherence as a program offering a certificate at the Harriman Institute after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this is the most recent version of the course. I just graded it last night, as a matter of fact, this semester. I'm a little late. Which I co-taught with Alexander Model, who was here yesterday. So he came home and helped me co-grade the course. So the idea is that it is always taught by a humanities person or a social scientist as well. Preferably, it is always, but once or twice has been taught by a man and a woman. And if there's time, I'd love to go into gender and area studies, but I doubt that we'll get there today. And the idea of it is to have students read almost every week things from every major discipline. in the region. Now, what's been fabulous about this course has been the mix of students. Sometimes frustrating, sometimes fabulous. It's every graduate student getting a Harriman Institute at Columbia University, which includes students from the School of International and Public Affairs, PhD and master's candidates from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, students sometimes from the law school, from the journalism school, from the School of Public Health, and many students, more and more, from the region and from different parts of the region. Who may or may not be emigres. I mean, again, we have this problem these days. Who's an emigrant and who isn't? You know, who will stay, who will go back? It's much harder to know. My personal favorite was a few years ago when we had an Azeri Golden Youth son who had already had a degree from the London School of Economics. He was collecting degrees. And a rather prominent Ukrainian human rights activist in the class at the same time. And quite honestly, the action was all with the student fighting. and it was part of what was to be studied. So in other words, we more and more have come to learn from our students, you know, because we cannot possibly know everything. And they bring with them a wealth of experience of growing up more and more post-Soviet, but especially because many of these students are older, they do have some Soviet experience. Although trying to account for the Soviet experience is becoming more and more, as it recedes into history, is becoming harder and harder. Another topic I think really should come up in this institute is the growing role of human rights, you know, the growing interest of human rights in the academy as a whole. One of the courses that we have put in at the Harriman Institute to respond to that is the next course, which is always a moving target because human rights is, of course, a moving target itself, human rights in post-communist Eurasia, which was originally put in by Peter Juveler, who was one of the real fathers of human rights, in relation to dissident studies at this institution. And then some kind of wilder courses that were not specifically Harriman courses, but I think, again, speak to the kind of ways we're trying to break, you know, to change the way we teach the region. This is a course that Mark von Hagen and I taught originally, and I've more recently taught with Richard Wortman, called Cities and Civilization: An Introduction to Eurasian Studies. And it was an attempt to organize the study of the region around cities, which is a very hot topic these days, and we're continuing to work on that. That was an undergraduate course. So again, unlike the two preceding courses where we did have a lot of people from the region in the course, or emigres, and that was a large part of what they were trying to do. This was mostly American-born students. And last is a course that was supposed to be taught this year or last year, but oh my goodness, and I left out the course I actually most meant to bring, because I know one of you is really interested in this topic. I did not bring my new post-coloniality course. But I'll talk a little bit. But the same person I taught it with, the instructor listed on socialist and post-socialist cities of Eurasia, Charles Armstrong, who is a Korea specialist. He's a historian. I'll come back to talking about that course in a moment, and I'll be happy to make copies of that syllabus available. I was rushing a little bit. This is a course to follow our post-coloniality course where we wanted to talk about East Asian and Eurasian and former post-socialist cities, really. And we hope to teach it if we are ever not on leave at the same time. We hope to teach this course eventually. This is a working draft. So I'll talk just finally, I'll take one more minute to talk about the fact that we also taught, inspired by Gayatri Spivak, as part of the required, well, not really required, sort of suggested courses for the Certificate in Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia for graduate students, a course that was designed to look at East Asia and Eurasia as areas excluded from post-colonial theory, and to discuss why they were excluded and what we learned from looking at post-colonial theory in dialogue with a lot of different texts. It was a fabulous course, mostly fabulous because of the people who were in it, and I think that's my hook to my emigre topic. There were no Russian emigres in the course. There was one first-generation Ukrainian immigrant. Of course, she is currently, there were two of them were my Barnard advisees. One of them was a Russian regional studies major. She is currently my Georgian instructor. She actually got her PhD at Columbia in ethnomusicology, focusing on Georgia. This is an American who has gone through Russian regional studies and learned Georgian fluently. She's married to a Georgian. Always helps. And the other one was in her cohort at Barnard. Also, she was our first Ukrainian regional studies major, and she is also getting a PhD in ethnomusicology at Columbia and working on Ukrainian folk music and rock music. So that also points to a big change in our students, not just Americans who are learning different regions of the former Soviet Union, but who are going into radically different disciplines. Ethnomusicology is not something that where they have to really train themselves to a certain extent. There is nobody at Columbia who knows anything about music in that region, except Boris Gasparov, and he's not in ethnomusicology. And then we had one French, a comparative literature specialist, who was wonderful and was very interested in doing the Francophone colony world. And then we had two Chinese students. So when you talk about emigres, you also get emigres from other areas of the world. And so it gave us a great comparative perspective. Obviously, I think what I'm pushing here is the idea that as we look at regional studies, and I'm going to try and keep my emigre lens here just a little bit out front, in the 21st century, to survive, it needs to be tremendously flexible in terms of the students it serves, of the way disciplines interact. And in that sense, the visionary project that was started by in the war to solve problems and use different disciplines coming together. And Marshall Shulman could be wonderfully eloquent on this subject of, bringing people from different points of views together specifically to solve problems. To my mind, and I'm a little bit utopian myself, is one of the healthiest models of real interdisciplinarity at a time in the university when administrators pay an awful lot of lip service to interdisciplinarity but don't really back it up much with institutional support. And so places like the Harriman Institute, and I'll throw some money in right now. Before the financial crisis, Harriman had a $45 million endowment. That's a nice chunk of change to be able to do these kind of experiments with. Not everybody has it, and it wasn't from the government. It's private money, and it is basically under the control of the faculty, not the administration at Columbia. This is an almost utopian situation. So it gives, I don't think, anybody else. I mean, I know that the Davis Center has probably more money, but it's more entailed. I mean, ours is very little entailed. We are also able to give a large chunk of it in student fellowships. So it gives us a tremendous amount of opportunity, to play around and do these kind of things, which hopefully will be the future, but, at a time when the humanities are under attack all over the place, at a time when vocational training is becoming more and more front and foremost, even at a university like this, at a time when emigres, in a sense, almost threaten language study because there is that model out there that language study is so expensive. Oh, there's all those emigres who can do all that work. We've got a lot more people emigres, or we can go to the region, or, we don't. In other words, not emigres as teachers, but emigres as actually translators. And the more there are bilingual speakers from the region, or the more we can see, we all know that beloved formula of administrators. Let's just send them off to study abroad for a semester, and that's their international experience, and we don't really need to invest in a lot of languages. So we are facing really serious threats, and ironically, again, the greater ability to travel to the regions is part of this threat. And obviously, I could go on for a really long time, but I'm going to stop there.